today, as many of you know. And what I thought I would do is introduce our panelists now, and then perhaps simply turn the floor over to them, starting with Debbie on my far right, and let them have a few words, and then we'll have a discussion, question, and answer. Does that follow your original plan, Catherine? I see when Catherine says jump, I simply say how high, so I know I'm just getting the details. Well, let me start with Debbie Dorsbach, who is with World Relief. She's the International Director for HIV/AIDS. She's trained as a nurse, so she actually knows something about this stuff, which many of us in the field wish we knew more. She's also a successful writer. That is also a challenge, I can tell you, having recently published a book, co-authored a book on the AIDS crisis. On my immediate right is Doug Balfour. He's had a distinguished career in international development agencies. He's now the International Director of Research at Geneva Global, which is seems to be a very interesting organization, intermediary organization, doing lots of important things. He's the ex-director of Interpol, which is an alliance of 12 Christian development and relief agencies, and was the General Director of Tear Fund, a Christian relief and development agency based in the UK. Did I say that right?
You did
I thought it was Tear Fund and not Tear Fund. English is not a very, especially when it's from the other side of the Atlantic, it's not a very reliable language. I'm out living there myself. To my immediate left is Will Recant.
Correct.
The Assistant Executive Vice President of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. He's done a lot of work in many parts of the world, but I think it sounds to me like one of his most interesting experiences lately has been in Cuba, working with the Jewish community there and others. He's the ex-director of the American Association of Ethiopian Jews, a very important element in the Ethiopian Jewish community. And finally, it's either Doug or Douglas, which do you prefer? Doug Bassett, my far left, is at Compassion International. He's the International Program Executive Director. He was at World Relief. Long experience in relief and development work. I noted especially a lot of experience in Latin America, so muy bienvenido. And without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to Debbie, and then we can just tool along.
I hope you can hear me. I'm battling a cold, so I'll try to project. Is it okay? In the back? Good. I will, of course, frame my discussions around and through the lens of HIV/AIDS, just so you understand my perspective. I'm an American, and I've lived 30 years in Africa, so it really is my other home. I'd like to begin with a basic premise, and that is that because we are faith-inspired, our very nature is defined by our faith. And faith isn't just another dimension in our organization or in our lives and how we live them out. It's our very substance. It commands how we view the world, interpret our success, drive our programs, envision our future. Our faith sustains us in critical periods and grows our compassion and enables us to do more with less. It permeates not only who we are, but what we do and how we go about doing it. And it also permits us to fail and to find reconciliation and a fresh perspective and hope once again. I think all those elements are very critical as we look especially at the HIV/AIDS crisis. AIDS is about relationships primarily. It's really not about a disease. A disease is a consequence, and in many situations there are failed relationships, not all, but in many. So it's reasonable then that issues of faith would be very relevant to the AIDS crisis. AIDS is about sex, it's about moral issues, whether there are men preying on young girls or wives who are faithful to their husbands but end up being infected themselves. AIDS is about people's future and the family, the orphans who are left behind, for example. And AIDS is also about death. Not everywhere, and increasingly increasingly less so. But for the majority of people, the lifespan is greatly shortened by this disaster. I'd like to give you an example of Jacqueline in Rwanda. She told me her story of how her husband most likely had infected her with the virus and began to feel extremely guilty about his own virus when he was approaching his last months of life. And he came at last to her and said, you know, I have been unfaithful to you. I brought this virus to myself and also to you and your family. And I am seeking now your forgiveness. And there's one thing I want to do before I die, and that is I want to marry you in the church. I want this to be a formal recognition of the life we've led together up until now, the children that we've had. And it was a beautiful expression of not only a time of healing in the family, but of some issues that they wanted to do together as a family, and the reconciliation it brought. And Jacqueline, even though her husband had died, carried on his legacy then for a long time because she had that faith perspective and strength and peace to go on. Historically, we haven't done a good job as faith-based communities in AIDS. I've been working in AIDS for about 17 years, and I can tell you that long ago it was not popular to talk about AIDS with church groups, with a few exceptions, and I must give accolades to the Catholic Church because they have just been steady in their commitment to serving people with HIV/AIDS, even very, very early on, even though there was a great deal of stigma, and even though they were brutally criticized for their stand on the condoms. But despite that, they kept at it, and they've been a model for many, many other faith-based groups, including the arm that I would identify with, the evangelical community, which only last year stated in a policy at the Lausanne Evangelization Conference. After 20 years, they said, and this was the third Congress, even though 2 other Congresses have gone before us, it's only now that we're recognizing how slow we've been to respond to this crisis, and it's shameful, and we offer confession to that. With that came dramatic change and hope. PEPFAR has changed a great deal, the Global Bank has changed a great deal, the World Bank, Global Fund, and the World Bank. And we're very grateful for these initiatives which now allow us to scale up a lot of what had already been happening in grassroots community. I think there are some major dangers, however, in this whole arena, and I'd like to articulate a couple of them. One is creating a sense of dependency. Now, we all know that that's a warning for us in development circles. But I think in particular where faith-based groups have often done without resources and found innovative ways to solve problems. Now that there's a great deal of attention and a lot more resources thrown into the mix, it can, if not handled very carefully, create a sense of, well, you do it and I'll watch. And it can also stifle initiative. I've seen that happen where now that others are getting involved, the sense of creative involvement and engagement by the grassroots has taken less of a front and center role in some places. It's also forcing us to look at evaluation criteria. Some of that's very, very helpful and necessary. I'm sure Doug is going to talk about that. He did an excellent report on that in his paper. But there are also some tensions in that because, you know, much of what faith-based groups has to do with relationships and not so much about metrics as we might normally define them in terms of numbers. And so we need to take a fresh look at how we evaluate our relationships and the change and impact that they make in society. I would say that faith really is a safety net in HIV/AIDS, but it's also a compass that is guiding all of life and relationship. And it's important to keep those two in balance in this development perspective. I would offer in closing just a couple of suggestions. First of all, I think we need to continue to integrate into normal structures and activities of faith-based groups these programs and not see them as detached or something else that is there for a season. All of our funding or engagement as international NGOs needs to make that a priority, that it becomes part and parcel of the whole outreach, which is already there anyway, whether they're youth groups or diaconal outreach through women's groups into the community for home care. We need to look proactively and not just at the immediate issues. For example, though many of us are interested in the orphan and vulnerable children crisis, how many of us are preparing for what our societies will look like in the future when these 15 million orphans or 25 million orphans in just a couple of years in Africa are adults and have grown up without parents and without that family structure? How many of us are preparing now for that scenario? And it's frightening to think of, but it would be even more frightening to cope with if we're not looking ahead to those issues. We need to hold each other accountable through continued dialogue and qualitative and quantitative review and documenting among ourselves what's working and what is not working. Without that, we can't progress. We will just be a drop in this huge sea of poverty and need and not be able to make significant change. We need to understand and permit our differences as well within the faith-based community. I think personally that while a blended soup is perhaps nutritious, it's not nearly as interesting as that yummy, chunky vegetable soup with those plump carrots and the chewy celery in it. And so I would propose that both are very nutritious and we need to permit one another to have our differences, to come together where we can and where we support each other, but not expect that we'll all be alike. We need to stay in the game in the policy arena long after the funding is gone from some circles, because our own voice is not optional. Faith is core to who we are as human beings. And I would close with an example from China. Interesting place where faith is played out in some subtle ways. But when we went to the Ministry of Health in China to talk about HIV/AIDS home care in China, they told us, well, you know, we don't really understand exactly what you mean by care. And the Chinese Christian woman that was standing next to me said, but I do. I'm Chinese, I'm Christian also, and I'd like to show our communities what care means outside of our own family. And so it's an exciting time to be implementing the core components of faith that will make dramatic change in the HIV/AIDS crisis and indeed the global future.
Thanks. I'd like to sort of generalize out a little bit to the sort of the larger development arena away from AIDS, although I think AIDS is a great subject that we can look at the effectiveness of faith-based organizations. My background is that I work with a Christian relief agency in Liberia through part of the civil war there. I then, for a decade, ran a Christian relief and development organisation in the UK. I think I'm the only foreigner on 2 panels. Now living in the States, which is offering me a very interesting perspective on sort of having seen the US from the outside in and now looking at more of the inside out. And had now working for Geneva Global, which is not a faith-based organisation. It's a for-profit intermediary of one of the hybrids that is growing up in the philanthropic space of advising the donor what they can best do in terms of investing their money into development work around the world. So I thought that the best thing I could possibly bring to this topic would be to maybe ask the question, So when can a faith-based organisation or a faith-inspired organisation really add value as part of a larger development effort in a nation? Because that's really been my perspective. In Tier Fund, in the UK, working as a funder, now advising donors, we are looking at faith-based organisations as implementers or partners on the ground. And by faith-based organisations, I'm thinking primarily of the often small, but not always small, national, indigenous, community-based organisations. And I had 7 comments and 2 appeals, really. My 7 comments start with the fact that why do you use, or why do you think about working with faith-based organisations from the donor perspective? Often, I think, in the situation where, especially in rural areas and areas far away from the urban centres, then it's often the only organised distribution vehicle that you actually have available to you to actually get development work done. Sometimes in conflict zones, the faith-based organisations are the only people to actually stay through the conflict, in the middle of the conflict, and will still be there at the other side of the conflict. Whereas actually a lot of the outside relief agencies like mine sort of have to leave and then come back later. So there's an element in which this is a wonderful development vehicle for us. We've talked about the examples of 40 to 70% healthcare in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, being actually delivered in one shape or form by faith-based organisations. And that's often in contrast to the amount of funding that comes through the national structures, through the governments, from Global Fund and others in terms of aid. I know Malawi is an example where nothing like that amount actually, the 40-50% of healthcare that is being provided, nothing like that comes through in terms of the funds. So there is still that discrimination and there is still that difficulty of actually getting the money to the community-based organisations, faith-based organisations on the ground. So that's my first point, that sometimes they're the development vehicle and possibly the only development vehicle available to us. Second is that it's interesting about the nervousness that the development community has about faith-based organisations, which is often not held by the beneficiaries themselves. When we look at all the various actors, the stakeholders involved in delivering development work, then a common perception is that from the beneficiaries themselves, when you talk to people, is that they're much more comfortable with somebody who is appearing with a faith perspective that may not be their own, but at least they can understand it. To not have a faith perspective often is a stranger and somewhat more suspicious perspective. And even in the midst of Afghanistan or working on the Pakistani refugee camps in Ashara and such like, then to be known as a Christian organisation working alongside refugees was at least an understandable concept, and people were comfortable with the type of value set that they could expect from even Christian organisations, although obviously there was other issues there. So that's my second point. My third point is that if we're looking for sustainability, then we have to, I think, see the community-based organisations and the faith-based organisations that again are part of the infrastructure of the country, often the infrastructure in rural areas where there possibly isn't any other infrastructure, as the sustainable vehicle, or one of the sustainable vehicles. The fourth point is the point that O'Keefe started to mention in the panel before our break, is that yes, there obviously does need to be Chinese walls between the parts of a faith-based organisation that may be involved in being a church, or proselytization, or reaching out and discipling or creating churches or mosques or whatever. And that obviously has to be worked through in the organisation. There needs to be a lot of work on boundaries. But my experience over the years looking at lots of projects is that that seems to be nothing like as big a problem in the two-thirds world than it is in the Western world, where we worry about such things. And I have seen, obviously, inappropriate use and insensitive use of crossing those boundaries. But nothing like over 10 years of Tier Fund, we funded 450 projects every year, the Christian implementers. And I was surprised at how many times when I was looking back, how few times I can actually remember feeling very uncomfortable about situations like that. I remember one relief situation where people decided to put banners over the side of their hotel in a very strongly Muslim context and saying all sorts of things about Jesus that I didn't think was a very wise thing to do. I also remember visiting clinics that started with prayer and thinking, I am uncomfortable about this. I wonder how people are actually viewing it. But in a sub-Saharan African context, which it was, probably nobody else was as worried as I was. So that would be my fourth point. We generally believe in Geneva Global, but one of the reasons that as a mainstream intermediary looking for the best possible return on investment for a donor in development work, that faith-based organisations are a very good bet. Of course, that's a massive generalisation, but in general, starting to look at the integrity of leaders that tend to be faith-inspired. We see less corruption issues. I mean, I've got plenty of examples where that isn't true, but generally, you can actually, you're often trusting somebody who has actually made working with this community their life calling and given all of their effort and all of their potential career into actually serving this community. The possibility of actually having lots of volunteers, which means that they work for the same amount of money, goes a very much longer way, and home care in sub-Saharan Africa in AIDS is a very good example of that. And then we also have the issues, the flip side of that, which is often faith-based organisations are small, not having necessarily audited accounts, sometimes not having the sort of processes and the reassurance vehicles that a lot of donors seek. So, it's not a straightforward formula. But all the data that Geneva's collected over the past 6 years, looking particularly at the NFI, the AIDS, community health, and slavery and human trafficking arena, would suggest that this hypothesis in general works out to be true, is that faith-based organisations actually are a very good social, give you a very good social return on investment. We talked a little bit about human rights, and I thought that just to touch on that from my perspective, and this is really confined to more the evangelical Christian community that in Tier Fund particularly I work within, is that there is a real nervousness around the rights language from the evangelical community worldwide. I think it's partly because it's perceived to have been picked up by the liberal Christian side of the church and made their own, and therefore there is issues around that. But evangelicals generally are much happier with responsibility language rather than human rights language. But the funny thing from my perspective is whenever you actually see an abuse of human rights, then the absolute instinct is to actually stand up and do something about it. So in real substance, I don't think there's very much of a difference in terms of what we would support and not support. It's just in terms of the way in which it's actually paced and the perspective in which it's used in terms of the actual language itself. My two appeals would be that and this did come out of some of the sort of background notes of my conversation with Catherine earlier, one of which is that we do need to work much harder on alliances. I'm a great believer in alliances and partnerships in development work across many different type of carrots and potatoes in that chunky soup. We really need to actually get the development actors to actually consider that they're working on a much larger canvas than their own. And control is always the issue, that whenever they get to the root cause of why people won't work together, it's usually an issue of power and control. Sometimes for what are perceived to be good reasons, not always for the abuse of power and control. But to be able to get the secular development actors together, the faith-based organisations, the community-based organisations, governments, the IFIs, to actually start to see that what we can do is nationally work on some joint plan for development seems to me absolutely where we should be going. And to try and actually get to the point where the type of bottom-up opportunity for real development for CBOs and FBOs to work together with the top-down governmental processes that FBOs can't normally work within, but only advocate for, seems to be really important. My last appeal as part of, and this is what you'd expect from Geneva Global, would be for much better measurement of impact. And the reason why I'd say that is that I think FBOs are the invisible hand of development. I think we are, the FBO community has largely been ignored until very recently. I think we would still be very surprised if we were able to actually do the mapping that we're talking about to see the enormous extent that faith-based organisations do provide in terms of care and education around the world. But my experience is, especially when I led a Christian NGO in the UK into the secular mainstream and made us stand on our own 2 feet and turn around and said we're just as professional as you are and had to deliver that, is that you had to work almost doubly hard to prove that you weren't religious nuts. So you start off on the perspective that these are crazy religious people, and then you have to actually prove otherwise. And from my perspective, one of the ways in which FBOs can actually inhabit this space and have more of a voice is if they attend to actually showing what type of impact they are actually having. And we all know that operational people are always too busy to write down and document what they're doing, but it is really, really important. So we have lots of anecdotal evidence, but very little academic research on the real impact, not just the activities, but the impact on lives that we're having. And my appeal would be that we try and make visible a lot more of the impact of this invisible hand of development.
Maybe we should save our applause till the end. It never works, but I thought I should say it.
Thank you. As the owner of the strangest acronym on the panel, I'll have to explain it. I represent the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. We don't distribute joints. We have nothing to do with prisons. It's a 93-year-old organization that came into being when the United States ambassador to Turkey, who was Jewish at the time, his name was Robert Morgenthau, went to Palestine to check on the Jews that were living in Palestine at the time. And when he got back to Turkey, he sent a telegram to New York saying basically, from your alphabet soup of Jewish organizations, can you raise $50,000 and form a joint distribution committee that will take those funds to Palestine and distribute it on behalf of all the different branches of Judaism to those in need. The organization was set up to be a one-time relief and assistance arm of the Jewish world. And 93 years later, I sit before you following 1914 is when we were formed, World War I, World War II, the interwar years. It was the Joint Distribution Committee that took care of the displaced persons camps from all of the concentration camps and throughout Europe and helped Jews, Muslims, Christians, Roma, Gypsies at the time, come out and relocate throughout Europe and elsewhere. Today, our major focus is rescue, relief, and renewal of Jewish communities outside of North America. But we have had an arm of the organization that has done non-sectarian relief and development work since our inception. In the 1920s, there was a project in Russia and in Ukraine called Agro-Joint, in which the Joint Distribution Committee taught people to farm land and taught people better techniques of agriculture. Today, the non-sectarian part of our work is encompassed in 28 countries. We are working in countries where there are Jewish communities, as well as countries where there are no Jews living. According to Jewish tradition, we believe in tikkun olam. Tikkun olam from the Hebrew means repair of the world. At my organization, we don't believe that we can repair the whole world. We don't believe that we have the ability to feed everyone, to take care of poverty issues from Africa to Asia to our own backyard here. But what we do believe is we have the ability to place band-aids on different parts of the world. We have the ability to repair issues. We have the ability to go in and start development programs and work with different denominations, people that we've never met before, seen before, to improve their lives. To bring the lessons that we have learned in 93 years of doing Jewish community work and share that with others. So to give some practical examples. We're in the midst of building a school in Rwanda. It's called the Agahazu Shalom Youth Village. Agahazu means dry your tears in Kinyarwanda, and Shalom means peace, means a lot of different things. This is the first of over a dozen schools that we will be looking to establish throughout Africa. And the way the school, the whole idea of the school came into being was one of our lay leaders saw the movie Hotel Rwanda, was very moved by what she saw, came to our office and said, what can we help? I learned that there are 1.2 million orphans in Rwanda as a result of the genocide. So we said, come to Israel and see a youth village that was put together for children of the Holocaust. In 1948, there were a series of youth aliyah villages set up throughout Israel where orphans of the Holocaust were taken and educated. And there's a holistic approach in the education. It's not just to teach them so that they can be high school graduates, but to be productive members of society and to feel that they're not orphans. And there's a familial atmosphere and environment at this village. So she went there, she saw it, she met with the pedagogic experts, and she met with some Ethiopian Jews who in the mid-'80s had left Ethiopia when the famine hit in the early 80s. And they were orphans of circumstance because their parents were still left in Ethiopia and they had made their way to Israel. So for 7 to 10 years, they were living as orphans in these villages. And when these Ethiopian Jews learned of the situation in Rwanda, they said, oh, we were raised in this village here in Israel, and we were inculcated with this feeling of family even though we were orphans. And we heard about what happened in Rwanda, and we feel terrible that at the time we were unable to participate because we were younger and we were still in school. But we now want to go back to Africa, and we want to bring some of the lessons that we've learned in Israel back to Africa, not to Ethiopia. We will set up a school in Ethiopia. But the first one is outside of Kigali. She came to Kigali, met with the Minister of Education, and then came back and embarked on a $10 million proposal to build this school. Within 1 year, ground has been broken. Within 2 years, a school for 500 kids will be up and operational. It will be run by them. There have been a group of Rwandans that have come to Israel to study the models that have been developed there and apply it and bring it back to their culture and their society. It's one of the great ironic twists in modern history. The Jewish community was one of the only ones trusted during the Bosnian War. When Sarajevo was completely isolated and cut off, and relief convoys were not allowed in, the Jewish world was allowed in. And the only convoy that came out of Sarajevo in the midst of the siege was 2,200 people. It came out Christians, Muslims, Jews, Roma, sponsored by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. Why? Because the Jews had no interest in Sarajevo. There was no Jewish community at war. Everyone trusted that what we would do would be honest, that we would be an honest broker in what was being done. I have had the privilege of seeing the best of human behavior. And the best of human behavior was sitting in the Stenkovic refugee camps in Macedonia, just outside of Kosovo, when the Kosovar Albanian Muslim community left and were living in refugee camps. And we were all setting up winterization programs at the time, thinking that the war would last a long time. And we were talking about what it would take, and then the Soviet Army left pretty quickly, and all the refugees started to go back into Kosovo immediately before winter came. And sitting at the table was Catholic Relief Service, Adventist Development and Relief, me representing Jews, others around the table, all the different faith-based organizations. And what was the subject as we walked into Pristina, as the embers were still burning? Okay, how do we work together in helping Albanian Muslims reclaim Kosovo? How do we work together so that they can create civil society? Okay, Catholic Relief Service was taking over the sanitation programs. Others were taking over every other part. And as interfaith group, we divvied up the various sectors. We took over education and rebuilt 36 schools in Kosovo province. No, there were 2 Jewish families living in Kosovo province, so there was no self-interest. And the worst of human behavior was flying into a refugee camp on the Somalian-Ethiopian-Kenyan border. The camp also was run by Catholic Relief Service at the time. And there were 48,500 people living in the camp. Children were still dying at an inordinate rate. Cause of death, malnutrition, starvation. Went to the head of the camp. How much food are you getting from the World Food Program and from UN? We're getting enough to feed for 50,000 people. So why are children still dying at such a high rate? Because the way we distribute the food, we can only give it according to local custom. And local culture says to us that we have to give all of the food for an entire clan to the head of the clan. And that person is in charge of distributing out to the entire clan. A clan can be up to 600 people. We're going around the camp. Islamic Relief had set up a mosque and a hospital in the midst of the camp. The women were all scrounging around for pieces of plastic to set up the little igloo-style huts we can find all over in the refugee camps in Africa and elsewhere. The children were running around throwing stones at our UN vehicle that we were driving in, to which my Israeli counterpart leaned over and said, it was the 1990s, so there was an intifada going on. And he lived in Jerusalem, and he said, I didn't have to come from Jerusalem to have stones thrown in my car. I could have stayed home because it happens all the time. And the men were standing around doing nothing. We see a small plane fly into the camp. The men grabbing bales of stuff, running up to the plane, putting the bales on, offloading other bales of things. And the plane took off within 10 minutes. The men were loading food onto the plane. They were offloading khat, which is a hallucinogen. They stand around and chew all day and get high. The men's belly were full. The women's were not, and the children were still starving to death in the camp. And when we met with the head of the camp again, we talked about a new distribution network that needs to be set up for this camp. We met with the heads of all the clans, and ultimately they did set it up. Couldn't get back home fast enough and hold my two daughters after seeing this behavior. You asked about Cuba very quickly. In 1992, there was a change in the Constitution of Cuba. And Cuba went from officially being an atheistic country to being a non-religious country. I was sitting with my PhD in political science and had no real idea of what that meant until the president of the Jewish community of Cuba called our office to say, there's not been a rabbi here in Cuba since 1964, and our community is just about dying out. But the difference is when we were officially an atheistic community, if anyone was seen walking into a church or walking into a synagogue, it meant that they weren't an atheist. And if you're not an atheist, you can't be a member of the Communist Party. And if you're not a member of the party, you can't advance professionally, personally, academically, or any other way. Now that there's a change in the Constitution, you can walk into a synagogue or church and still advance. So there was the beginnings of some opening of religious tolerance. And my first visit to Cuba was in 1992 with an interfaith mission that was going to study the emerging non-governmental sector in Cuba. And what we really found was there was no non-governmental sector in Cuba apart from the church groups. And the faith-based organizations were the ones that were really creating civil society and really starting dialogues. Fast forward from 1992 to today, I've been back to Cuba 50 times. We're still not allowed to send a rabbi in, and no outside denomination is allowed to send a foreign priest or reverend into Cuba to be there permanently. So there's still no rabbi in Cuba today. And we did send rabbis in to check out the situation. We sent in community development workers and a doctor. And the doctor came in 1993, and he sent a report. And he said, I went to hospitals, I went to medical schools, I talked with doctors, I told them I was Jewish and I was here to set up programs and help. Good news and bad news. The good news, I found no discrimination, no anti-Semitism from government sources on down through all of the different church groups that I met with. The bad news, I found no antibiotics and I found no sutures in Cuba. And if we want to help our Jewish community, which is very small, about 1,500, maybe we can set up a pharmacy in one of the synagogues. And every time you send a group down, bring in things that are needed by the pharmacy. That pharmacy has now grown into the second largest pharmacy in Havana. It provides all of the medications that any of the Jewish community comes in and asks for, as well as anybody else that walks in with a prescription. We are fully linked with Caritas, and our pharmacy and Caritas pharmacy work hand in hand. No one is turned away. What I would like to end with is, a little earlier we talked a little bit about the rescue, relief to development continuum. And when you walk into Kosovo, and the embers are still burning, you see literally dozens of vehicles up and down the main street of Kosovo with signs on the side saying Catholic Relief Service, Lutheran Development and Assistance, International Rescue Committee, World Vision, and just keep going. You see more and more of these signs. I'm not interested in any of the signs on the side of the vehicle, as well as my own sign, which appears just as well as everybody else's, because our donors want to see that we are there just as well as everyone else. We're still in Kosovo. There aren't too many other vehicles that I'm seeing when I go to Pristina anymore. We're still in Sri Lanka. Many of the tsunami organizations had moved out. They came in, they spent their money, and they left. In all of the projects that we do, we see a relief to development continuum at play. I do believe that you can bring in standards of accountability, transparency, and I think that you can put them in matrix and you can be evaluated. And I think that, final statement, faith-based organizations, interfaith-based, meaning Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, need to sit together at the table more frequently and share models of development that work as well as the models that don't. And as faith-based organizations, we should be working on best practices and making sure that I know what everyone else's best practices are, and that we can share the knowledge that we have each garnered in our different faith, in our different development programs, and have stronger impact. Very last comment. Unlike many of the other organizations, we receive very, very little government funding. Our funding comes from Jews and non-Jews throughout the United States that support programs of humanitarian rescue, relief, and development. We receive a total of about $500,000 from the United States government, from USAID. And I sit as the coordinator of a Jewish coalition of now 46 organizations. And from all of those organizations, we only receive $1.2 million in US governmental funding for overseas international development projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So on to number 2.
Thank you. I do want to thank the Berkeley Center. This has been very stimulating, both this panel as well as the one this morning. Let me just say a couple words about my organization, because it's not as well known as most of the organizations here. I'm with Compassion International. We're an evangelical Protestant organization working in 24 countries. We work by partnering with local Protestant churches, so we work with churches from Pentecostals, Anglicans, currently about 56 denominations we have. With the local churches, we have formal partnerships. We believe deeply in a couple things. One, we believe deeply in partnering with local churches. That's what we do in terms of carrying out our work around the world. We also believe deeply in holism. And for us, holism, we focus on work with children. As we talk about children, we'll talk about 4 areas. As a faith-based organization, we'll talk about the spiritual area, we'll talk about cognitive development, socio-emotional development, physical development, and we try to incorporate those 4 things in what we do. We believe deeply that the church is called to reach out in holistic ministry. Not just to children, but that's our particular focus as we work. I think Steve from Habitat for Humanity referred a little earlier to this what we call but Christians. In other words, Christians who say I'm Christian, but we don't proselytize. So in our case, we do support proselytization. We prefer to use the term evangelization or simply sharing our Christian faith. I understand what's going on with those who feel they have to say the but. I've been in many situations where adding that phrase would make it a lot easier to be in a meeting, whether with government or people or other organizations, because there are a lot of strong feelings, and one can at times feel that the conversation may shut down when one admits to it. But we do believe that we should share our faith. But let me say a little more about that. I find it interesting discussion on proselytization based on my experiences and my organization's experiences around the world. We very strongly believe that there should not be coercion. We very strongly believe that there needs to be an effort to understand and be sensitive to local cultures. I would recognize that has not always happened, things that go on. But I do deeply believe that by and large, most of those who do share their faith or evangelize have sought to do these things, to not be coercive and be sensitive. There's some reasons for that. In our case, as we work with as close to 4,000 churches, those churches are part of that community. We don't plant churches, we go out and we work with churches that are out there. And actually, our reality is they come to us. We have an extensive request to enter into partnership. They're part of that community, they're from that culture. They know the issues very well of the religions there. They come from families from those backgrounds, but they're, by their very nature, going to be more sensitive and more attuned to that because they want to be there. They want to continue in their community. So I think in practice, there's some natural checks. One of the things that I think for most of us as humans, we would like to have unity. We would like to be able to identify with those around us. Well, that happens for evangelical Christians as well, as they seek to share their faith and get along with the people who they're with. This at times for evangelicals, I would say, is a struggle, both a belief that's central to how evangelicals understand their Christian faith, that they should share their faith. I believe that's a command from a very clear scriptural command, yet an understanding of times people are going to react very negatively to that. But I do believe that these things can be done in a sensitive manner. We, as regards to disasters, we're not a relief organization, but we have defined for ourselves how we'll react in a disaster or relief situation. First of all, we always defer to the judgment of those who are on the ground to make those calls, and people from those areas. Our priority, if we are in a disaster situation, it's hit where we are, is humanitarian aid, and we're clear about that. We don't want to do anything that could take advantage of people in a vulnerable situation. So the priority is humanitarian aid. That said, and I think Deb alluded to this, we do believe hope is a part of times facing disasters. And so based on what's going on there, a person may choose to share an appropriate order. But that, again, that's something other people who are in the situation will face. But I believe that by and large, most organizations who are out there are seeking to be culturally sensitive on these issues and not to be coercive. Just a last aspect of that is just simply to understand that for many of us to be coercive, beyond being morally wrong, simply defeats the whole purpose. These are things that people have to choose for themselves and they cannot be thrust upon them. But I tend to believe that there's a lot of misunderstanding surrounding that. One of the things that Mr. Hammer mentioned in his paper and this morning, and some others have alluded to, I think he used the term that the positive side of unleashing people's faith. And that's something I personally deeply believe. Is we look at different faith traditions. I happen to be an evangelical, but that there's incredible power in different traditions. And that one of the things as we look at ways to work together is we don't want to undermine that. That faith motivation is enormously important. I'm one who believes that what's going on out there is far bigger than people understand, but they don't necessarily get a handle on it because of the fragmented nature of it. These hundreds of thousands of things of significance around the world. But I think within something like this, we want to unleash that power. We don't want to approach things in a way that can actually seem to restrict it and the many good things that have come out of that. I think that's an interesting area to explore. Wanted to just make a few comments about the issue of common ground. It's interesting. I come from the conservative spectrum. I use the label conservative and moderate. I guess I'll try to choose in this situation. When I say conservative, I mean theologically conservative, nothing beyond that. As we look for common ground, it's an interesting thing when you come from the conservative side of the spectrum. I think as we see most organizations who engage in these kind of processes would be on the moderate side. Clearly within the Christian tradition, and that's my sense in other traditions that I don't know as well. And it's an interesting challenge how we come to, how as conservatives, theologically, we engage in these kind of things. One of the probably things that I see for those of us on this side is simply probably a need to grow in the understanding that we can relate to those who are different. That it doesn't mean that we're compromising on the theological aspects of what we do. probably the history, a bit of recent decades, so it's changed significantly, of evangelicalism had been to not associate with those who were different, even though there were areas that we could associate. That said, as an evangelical, there is great concern on the theological side, and at times as we do engage in some certain things, we probably feel that the moderates don't understand some of those concerns that we might have. In other words, some of the ways that we come together for common ground may imply some compromise on some things that to us cut to the core of how we understand our faith. As I made some comments about how we see development, we really do see the spiritual aspect as a part of human development, and a very important part. It influences socio-emotional development, it influences physical development. For us to pull that out is a very, very serious thing, and it creates great discomfort, yet seeking common ground can be separating that a bit. I think that's an interesting area of discussion, because obviously there are different faith traditions who have strong views on that. I think there are people who come at this from a, not necessarily from a traditional religious perspective, but also would acknowledge a spiritual element. They may, of course, understand it very differently. But as we seek to, as faith-based organizations come together, and as I say, we might seek to bring more conservative organizations aboard, I think some of those issues have to be struggled with a bit. One of the other things I would share is based on some of my field experience, and it's going to sound quite counterintuitive to some of you, is I would actually propose that in many circumstances, the outreach of religious organizations, including spiritual aspects, has actually contributed to greater understanding with other religions. Often in conservative traditions, we are in our own ghetto, as I think somebody has said, amongst people who think very similar to us. Well, the process of going out and interacting with others helps us to begin to understand those things. I think that more often than not reduces misunderstandings, far more than it creates new tensions. And that, for us, over and over, has been an experience that we have had as we go out and interact with other groups. We still see differences, and we recognize the differences, yet there is greater understanding and greater appreciation of those groups. We've also found the same thing in terms of how they would see us, that they may have had certain impressions of what an evangelical was, or a Christian in some of the, especially some of the Asian cultures that we were in. Yet that process of interacting brings understanding. So while it's counterintuitive, I genuinely believe greater understanding is achieved between groups far more often than greater tensions are produced. Somebody alluded, or it may have been Doug, to the fact that also as we interact with other places, I think there are people who naturally relate to another religion in a way that they don't relate to those who don't necessarily espouse the religion. It's just a natural part of the way they see the world. So there's some interesting dynamics and different perspectives on that. Maybe just one last little thought, so we can have some questions here, is in these kinds of interactions, one of the things that maybe I haven't heard enough that I think is really important is a belief in religious freedom. One of the things I've reflected on over the years, because of my evangelical beliefs, because I believe in the freedom to be able to share my Christian faith, that I also need to believe in the freedom of religion in general. And I think that's an interesting area of actual common ground. In other words, championing that we don't come together because we're kind of eliminating differences. Some of the differences are very real, but we come together around things such as the belief that there should be freedom of choice with religions. That we see differences, yet we almost kind of can accept that those differences. We can agree to disagree. And I think that would be a very interesting basis to broaden things, to find ways to agree to disagree in a way, frankly, that may actually be much more comfortable to some conservatives. Anyway, those are just kind of some stray thoughts. A lot more I could say, but I'll leave this time I'm honored.
Introduce yourselves, and there are microphones in both aisles, so then direct your question to the appropriate panelist. We all frozen in fear. Have some brave soul.
Hi, thank you, first and foremost. This has been really good. My name is Kyle Lehman. I'm a master's student in democracy studies here. And I was wondering if, in your experience, you find that political development is too far outside the mandate of faith-based organizations to be useful in a broader sense of development, that democracy promotion is a loaded word, but party development or civil society development, that especially in my work, my background in community organizing, that especially in America, a lot of the opportunities for that is through churches in the political sphere at least. So I was wondering if, in your experience, is there room for that, or is that counterintuitive or counterproductive for the work of your organization?
I'm quite happy to answer in the positive, really. In my experience, faith-based organisations as part of civil society not only have a very big part to encourage the strength of civil society, but are an important part of it. And I just was going to sort of quote two examples. One that I was involved in the UK, which is the Jubilees of Thousand movement, which kind of kicked off in the UK and then sort of started to spread across the world in terms of looking for debt relief. Basically, it was the churches originally that got so many people out on the streets of 60,000 people went onto the streets of Birmingham that really sort of gave the whole movement some life, that led to other large-scale protests, which actually got the UK government to take it seriously, which then started to put it onto the agenda and started to actually get some movement on that subject. It was really the first time, I think, that especially a lot of the conservative churches had really ever gone out onto the streets and demonstrated about anything. And so you sort of saw very uncomfortable old ladies sort of demonstrating with placards, and I'm sure it was the first time they've ever done it. But it was an incredibly important moment in time where I think the faith-based community within the UK saw that they had a major role to play, and then got incredibly encouraged that they could actually change some of the debate. So I see faith-based organisations both at sort of the, if you like, in the Western Hemisphere, as well as my example from in the two-thirds world would be Ecuador. We were, Geneva Global was facilitating some funding, actually with the USA, on human trafficking in Ecuador, and as part of that we brought together a community of small CBOs, some of which were faith-based organisations, some weren't, and they started to work together on seeing if they could actually get the law changed in the government of Ecuador on the not just the actual law in terms of covering slavery and human trafficking of children and adults, but also to actually get it enacted and give some sort of real political